I'm absolutely sure that you'd all agree with me that John Dunster is a person who's worth talking about. It might not be that obvious why I should be the person talking about him. I mean, in this country there must have been about 5,000 people who knew John better than I did. And the other question might be, why should we do this twice? And I shall try to come up with answers for these two questions. In the first place, why me? Well, none of you did it, but also John was very much appreciated in the Nordic countries. And if you promise not to call for armed response from your police forces because I revealed something out of the stuff that's protected by the Official Secrets Act, I can tell you there are 2 international accolades for radiological protection. One of them is the Sievert Award, which is awarded by ARPA, and the Nordic Society for Radiological Protection, of which I am of course a member, proposed John twice and we never managed to get him through, but it did piss us off that so many other countries proposed members out of their own membership but didn't think to look at who is the best person in the world, who do we want to propose, who is most worthy, instead of just trying to propose their own pet candidates. And the other accolade that I would mention is the gold medal of the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, which is, well, this is another secret, that the medal is paid for by the legacy of Sievert. So Sievert was involved in that as well, but he was very keen that it not be named after him, not least because of the risk of confusion with the Sievert Award. And we proposed John as the recipient of that several times, and that also was not successful. But at any rate, I represent people who would have wanted to see John Dunster get one of these accolades. Why are we doing this twice? I think that's a very simple answer. That's a beautiful embroidery that I've seen in many a location, because one of the hobbies of John was to move house, and so he moved from place to place to place. I visited his house in Wallingford, in Oxford, in London, again in Oxford, again in Wallingford, in a different place in Wallingford, and so forth. It must be a method to make sure that the kids get nothing out of the money you've saved them your life. Anyway, this beautiful embroidery in Rose's careful hands said, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly. And I was thinking that, okay, if it's worth doing badly, then perhaps it's also worth doing twice. John, of course, is well known because he's been an advisor in radiological protection, he's been a senior regulator, he's done lots and lots of international work in all the various committees, and he's been one of the absolute leaders of cleaning up after the Windscape accident. He was involved in Chernobyl. I will mention a couple of things about Fukushima which were affected by his work, and I will try to summarize what I think are the attributes of a genuine pioneer. So, if we look at John's CV, he was with the Admiralty during the war and did typical physics work with the acoustics of torpedoes and submarines. In 1946, he joined the atomic energy program that turned into the Atomic Energy Authority, and he actually made release assessments for Windscape, which then were converted into the discharge limits for the Windscape plant. In 1957, we of course had the fire, which was, I think, the seminal moment, the occasion when people realized that there are real nuclear accidents. And of course, John was the person who made sure that there was milk monitoring and radiological criteria. And in 1970, after quite a long gestation period, but as a result of the Windscape event, NRPD was created and John was made the Assistant Director for Operations. He went on to become Deputy Director General for Nuclear Safety at HSE, and after some time there, he returned to NRPD, where he was the director from 1982 to 1987, which meant, of course, that he was the director of NRPD at the time of the Chernobyl accident. I was not there when he was working at the Atomic Energy Agency. I was born in 1944, so I would have been too young at the time. But somebody has told me that they were present at a meeting on neutron dosimetry at Windscape, and John was eloquent as always and making a very assertive, erudite statement, and then suddenly he interrupted himself and said, "I'm talking complete rubbish." And the reason why I'm bringing this up, because that was because this person who gave me this anecdote, he said he was mightily impressed, A, by the fact that somebody, this senior, could even talk rubbish, but even more so because that person would also be able to confess immediately. And I think it tells you a lot about John. He would not hesitate. He would always say the truth, even if it wasn't that comforting for himself. He worked with the international organizations, and just to bring those of you who are perhaps not into radiological protection into the picture, there's a United Nations committee called UNSCAR, and the pronunciation is chosen with some care. The UNSCAR committee states, here's how much radiation there is in the world, and here's how dangerous that is. And that information is passed on, nowadays at least, to the International Commission on Radiological Protection, which merges whatever UNSCAR does with what itself does and what other committees do, and says, because there's so much radiation, and because it's that dangerous, you ought to, blah, blah, blah. And this blah, blah, blah is very interesting and very useful for people who want to understand why they're doing things. But then we've got the regulators, and they need to go beyond understanding. So they translate the recommendations of ICRP from English into legal. And that happens internationally in the United Nations system and locally for us in the Brussels system. And although we are only obliged to follow the directives that pop up in Brussels, of course the international scene is much more affected by the United Nations basic safety standards. Anyway, John was involved in all of these international organizations. He was the United Kingdom's representative to UNSCAR from 1982 to 1992. And this is a very senior mission. You're a diplomat. It's not like NRPD says we'll send John. It's like the Foreign Office says we need a person, so we select the head of NRPD. It's the Foreign Office that decides who goes. This was the first time that I actually met John. This is in 1984. And I had been a geneticist, and I was recruited into the Radiological Protection Authority in Sweden to become a regulator, because people had understood that I was just shite as a research worker, but I could be useful as a bureaucrat. And in that unskilled meeting, at the time they had something called the genetics subgroup, which was an anomaly from the very beginning and which caused much trouble for the people who were doing the real work. And in that committee, there were two old friends of mine, Tony Sörd and Sankaranarayanan. And these two people used to be very good friends, but on this particular meeting in 1984, they fell out because of a misinterpretation on one or the other side. I can't remember which one was wrong, but in any case, that they fought over the question, is there a 0.304 or 0.308% risk per millisievert to the genetic material? And hundreds of people were at this very expensive meeting, waiting and waiting and waiting for this subgroup to produce any result that could go into this report that had to be distributed over the entire world. And these two people were fighting. And John was certainly not known to everybody as a diplomat. He was known to be rather a blunt person. But I was amazed to see him come in and solve this problem in less than an hour. But by listening carefully to both of the persons and saying, well, since your number is right, but your terminology is right, why not mix these two things? He was brilliant in summarizing what the important factors were in what was said. So at that time, I learned that he was a very intelligent person, very receptive. I don't think he actually knew any genetics, but he knew how to listen to people and to hear what was important. I didn't have a camera at the time, that's why I had Blackboard Jungle to provide the picture for you. Here's a joke that will be lost on almost everyone in this room. Possibly Chris will understand that it's a joke for somebody coming from outside the United Kingdom that you believe that you're not part of Europe. I fondly remember my first few visits to England when you used to come with the ferry to Harwich, and there was one line, very short line, UK passports, and another line, alien passports. And aliens, that's apparently where you come from when you're from the remainder of Europe. Anyway, he was an expert in the Euratom Science and Technology Committee and in the Article 31 group of experts, which is a very important body indeed. And he was at the International Atomic Energy Agency and in their scientific advisory committee, and he did lots and lots of different tasks for them. Here's a picture of John in 1982. This would have been the time, and I think you can spot Roger as well there, and Rose in the picture. As I said, the Foreign Office assigns this task to you when you go to the agency. This means that you have diplomatic rights when you're in the United Nations buildings. I have had a number of memorable moments during the time when John had this particular capacity to run down to the commissary and get whatever there was there, and Parishton thought that he would drink too much. No, that was not what happened, but he would drink sufficient amounts, if you get my drift. And it was wonderful to learn about all these different whiskies. However, his most cherished international commitment was with ICRP, the International Commission on Radiological Protection. Here's a picture from one of the early days in 1978 with perhaps the 5 most important persons at the time in radiological protection. You can see John there in a rather relaxed position, and David Soapy, who's still up and running in Ireland. Chris and I visited him last year to check that everything was right. Bo Lindell is sitting as chair of the meeting We visited him quite recently, and Dan Valentin, who's unfortunately deceased now, who was the vice chair at the time, and Henri Chanet, also sadly dead now, who was the Committee 4 chair at the time. Henri Chanet could not swim, which didn't stop him when he went to the Oslo meeting in 1972 of Committee 4 of ICRP to go to the pool and jump into it. And actually, John saved his life. And this is not, I mean, it was not like he helped him up. He literally saved Henri Janet's life because he was going to drown there in this very pool, which is on the picture. He did some other work as well. He was an active contributor during his 47 years of ICRP work. He was a member of Committee Roman 5 at the time, when that existed, talking about isotopes and red waste. He became a member of Committee 4 on the bureaucracy of ICRP from 62 to 77. Then he was elected a main commission member, and part of that time he was the chair of Committee 4. And then after 1997 and until his demise, he was the emeritus member of the main commission. He was the lead author of publication 5 on the disposal of red waste. He was involved in publication 7 on environmental monitoring, i.e. what to do after a release of radioactive material. And he was involved in publication 8 on radiation risks. He was involved in publication 12 on the monitoring of workers, and so on. And in the meantime, of course, there were meetings and meetings and meetings. In 1972, he infuriated the then chairman, Bill Poaching. I'm sure many of you met Bill Poaching, who was another one of these intimidating persons that you don't want to infuriate. But John did so. And afterwards, David Soberly has said to me that this is a bit I haven't chosen quite the right word. Laptop is an anachronism in this picture, because of course it wasn't the laptop in our current terminology. He brought some kind of programmable computer thing, and that infuriated Bill Poaching. He didn't want to see people working with their contractions. Perhaps we need more Bill Poachings today. One of the things with John was that he was very, very foresighted. A letter of his which discusses the possibility of regulating collective dose per unit energy. If you're going to have nuclear energy in a country, you need to discuss the justification. If you're going to decide whether it's justified, you must compare the amount of harm that it does to the amount of good things that it does. And of course, that was the background why he wrote to Bergendale to discuss the possibility of measuring and perhaps even regulating the amount of radiation dose that you would permit from a particular nuclear power plant, taking into account how much electricity it would produce. He continued to write stuff. He was very much involved in publication 22, which was where ICRP started to talk about doses as low as readily achievable. He was talking about the population dose there, and then he went on to talk about another aspect of environmental release is now the modeling before a release, whether that be planned or unplanned. Of course, he was the main author of publication 60, the 1990 recommendations. To understand the greatness of that achievement, you must take into account that he had a stroke in September of 1987. But at the time when they were working as hard as possible, and of course it was John was above a stroke. He didn't bother too much about that. such things were not to be taken too seriously. Okay, I've had a stroke, so I can't drive any longer, but I will continue my serious work. And then, of course, he was instrumental in the publication where we came up from ICRP with the source-related public dose constraint of 0.3 millisieverts, which is very useful when you're talking to members of the public, because you can say to them, okay, that's a dose limit for members of the public of 1 millisievert per year, but no particular establishment can utilize that entire dose limit. There's something called the dose constraint, which applies to every particular source. And there's no way that there will be more than 3 significant sources exposing you at the same time. So 0.3 millisieverts for any particular source will be perfectly enough to ensure that you're never above the dose limit. Here's another occasion where I would have wanted to have a camera. This photo was not taken at the meeting when he said, if you allow me to interrupt myself, you will recall, I'm sure, that John was very fond of talking. He said very many interesting things. One was very fond of listening, but at times perhaps there was a slight overdose. Now let's turn to the serious problem of the Windscape Fire, which Lorna Arnold, of course, is described as an accident waiting to happen. And here's this nice photo where you can see Cockcroft's Follies at the top of the chimneys. Basically, this was an air-cooled reactor. It was graphite moderated and air-cooled. And of course, the air that went through the uranium elements and up through the chimney would bring radioactive material with it, and particularly whenever there was some slight problem with the fuel elements. And therefore Cockcroft said, we need to have filters. Cockcroft being a Nobel Prize winner, people listened to him even though they thought it was rather silly. I'm sure that people after the Windscape accident were very happy that he come up with this, because otherwise the accident, the fire at Windscape, would have had much more serious consequences. In any case, the problem, well, there were many problems, but the particular problem that led to the fire was with this Wegener energy. It turns out that when you have these graphite moderated reactors, the graphite assembles a lot of energy, which is called Wegener energy, and that energy can lead to so much heat that there's self-ignition. And to get rid of that energy, they came up with a solution that from time to time they would heat the graphite, and that would release this energy in a controlled format. Although the word controlled perhaps doesn't really apply here, but it was supposed to be controlled. Anyway, what happened at one occasion was, unfortunately, the graphite actually did ignite. And of course, this proves that the design was unreasonable. But why was it unreasonable? Well, that was because the Americans didn't want to share their technology, even with you guys, let alone with us, of course. So one had to invent the technology so that the United Kingdom could have their own atom bomb. If the boy next door has atom bombs, I need my own atom bombs, of course. But there was also a serious lack of operator judgment, and this was particularly obvious in the late request for assistance. I mean, it was not very clear at which particular moment in time the fire started. There's an official decision later on that it started on the 10th of October 1957. People didn't ask for police to stand by for the possibility of an evacuation until on the 11th of October. on the 11th of October, a bit later, the fire was extinguished, and that was the time when they started thinking perhaps we should have brought in some of the people who know something about radiation and radiological protection. So they brought in John and Andrew McLean and Reg Palmer at the time, and John made the proverbial back of an envelope calculations on, I believe, literally the back of an envelope. Just to finish the question of accidents waiting to happen, we can also see that this is a case of regulatory insufficiency. In this case, not because there was anything wrong with the regulator as such, but because the politicians hadn't really thought about the question, who is going to regulate nuclear weapons? And this is rather a touchy question. To be the regulator, you need to have information that perhaps the people who are interested in the weapons as such are very unhappy to share. And if you end up with a solution that the weapons people themselves are regulating, well, I'll be there with you in a moment and to show what happens in that case. Anyway, John's achievements in this event was that he produced an immediate set of milk restrictions, just like after Chernobyl. The number is still not that bad. He realized that there had to be restrictions on grazing, and an environmental monitoring program, and a set of radiological criteria for protection of the public. And what I'm trying to say is that before the Windscape accident, we didn't have the set of tools. We didn't know what to do if there was a major radiological accident. And what John did, which was so fantastic, was to immediately invent the entire toolbox to tell us how do we handle an accident. There might be different versions of the monkey wrench today. There might be different tools, but he was the one who provided the very first toolbox, and this was very significant and has helped us on too many an occasion afterwards. If you look at the consequences of the accident, of course, thank goodness that there was no immediate death, and there will have been a number of fatal cancer cases. You would find the odd person who would say that's a threshold and therefore no cancer at all. A more reasonable person would say, well, the cancer cases would have been in the hundreds, perhaps. I.e., in other words, there's no way at all to detect it. But the result of this was that we all received this wonderful handbook of radiological protection, which is now obsolete, but it started us thinking about the fact that we all need handbooks like this. Now, to understand the problems that John was facing, you must remember that this was the time of James Bond. This was at the time of the Cold War, and the Russians were hiding in their basements, afraid of the bomb that the Americans would drop on them, and the Americans, of course, were hiding in their basements, worried about the bombs that the Russians would drop on them. And this was the real James, of course, and he was driving this car, which at 135 miles per hour, I'm sure it was fast enough for a secret agent, but I think it's not that unconspicuous. I would have selected another car for being a secret agent. This was the type of lady that James Bond might be happy to find to keep him company. Now, to be serious, here's the United States Atomic Energy Commission, which was exactly what I talked about a moment ago, a regulator and producer of weapons. Here's another picture of the commission, and this was, of course, at a time when radiation was wonderful, and you could, for instance, buy your own atomic energy lab. Not long ago, Wendy kindly sent me a message about a boy who's even now done a personal atomic energy laboratory in his own home. So Americans are still at it. But basically the message that was propagated to the public is that atomic energy is a force for good. They would drive around with these buses to talk about atoms for peace at the same time as they were producing bombs galore. Because they were afraid of the communists, of course. And they had these guards. And I would have felt perhaps that the people who were trying to demonstrate against the risks of atomic bombs looked less dangerous than the actual guards outside the Atomic Energy Commission. So, the problem that I see with the Atomic Energy Commission was a classical one, the dual role of weapons tester and fallout hazard assessor. And the first example of that problem was, of course, the Baker A-bomb test at Bikini, where sailors were decontaminating ships, wading ankle-high in fallout. But then, in 1954, we had the ill-fated Bravo H-bomb test at Bikini, where, of course, a number of people in the nearby atoll, Rongelap, were not evacuated in advance. And if I've understood things correctly, this is because they believed the wind would be blowing in another direction, but unfortunately that was not the case. So an average dose of between 1 and 2 sieverts to each person. So of course all of these people developed acute radiation syndrome, and they were evacuated at that stage, but the Atomic Energy Commission said that, well, nobody had serious burns on their skin, so everything's just fine. And in 1957, they were allowed to return to their home, but they were told, you must not go there or there or there, and you must not eat anything which is produced on your own atoll. It was not until 1985 that they were then moved to somewhere else where they could at least walk around their own home place and feed from food that they obtained in the other place. And Greenpeace, of all people, organized that. I think some goodwill could have been obtained by the United States if they had come there before Greenpeace. And of course, the other tragic event in the context of Bravo was the fishing boat, the Lucky Dragon, this Japanese fishing boat, which was also exposed. 23 of the sailors contracted acute radiation syndrome, and 1 died, which induced the American ambassador in Tokyo to seek out the widow and hand her a check for $2,800, which again was not perhaps an exercise in public relations. And at a Congress hearing in 1957, the Atomic Energy Commission said fallout in general poses no danger. And this is because one doesn't need to take account of this phenomenon of food chain transfer. I think you can find a lot of scientists in this building right now who are very interested in doing food chain transfer examinations and would come to a different conclusion. However, to bring us back to John, I'm going to point to the Goffman-Tamping controversy. Somebody called Ernest Sternglass, who seems still to be around and publish silly papers at times, published some very strange allegations against the Atomic Energy Commission. So now suddenly AEC, in this particular context, is the relatively good guy in my story. And this Sternglass fellow said that all the children around nuclear establishments will die due to normal releases, basically. And the Atomic Energy Commission asked a medical doctor called John Goffman and Arthur Tamping, a PhD who was actually working with the AEC at the time, to reply. And they came up with the conclusion that this Sternglass estimate was widely exaggerated, but they also said that in principle thousands of people will die due to releases from nuclear power plants, which actually isn't that silly if you count all the nuclear power plants in all of the United States and make integrals for all time, forever. But the Commission said to Tamping and the government, don't publish that. And of course they replied that, well, actually we personally believe that the risk may be even higher, which led to the simple solution that they were fired. Now, where does this connect to John? Well, that is because he concluded, and this is from a letter, another letter from John to Bo Lindell. He concluded that their work was not at all stupid. It was perhaps misguided, but they were not seriously wrong. Their estimate was not that far off. And well, I'm basically a biologist, as I said, which means I do not know a difference between 1 and 2. I only count 1, 10, 100 and so forth. And because of that, you can say it is not very much off if you come with a risk estimate which is a factor of 3 wrong. The only thing that John also said was they need to be taken seriously, but their letter to the Atomic Energy Commission was disgraceful. So basically I'm trying to say John was a very open-minded person. He was not afraid of listening to somebody who you would expect to say something silly, but to take each statement for its own worth, to check, is this particular statement correct? And then if it came from the right or the wrong person, that would not matter. It was whether it was correct that mattered. And conversely, of course, even if the right person said something silly, he would not hesitate to say so. Chernobyl, of course, was again an unnecessary accident, and primarily due to operator recklessness. But if we look more closely at the system, in this case it was a problem of regulatory insufficiency, not due to political, or not only due to political problems, but also due to problem with the regulator themselves. Then one of my hobby horses, some of you are well aware, is mutual trust, that a regulator cannot function unless the licensee trusts the regulator. That's the only way that you can achieve a situation where the regulator in turn can trust the licensee. This is not what happened in the Soviet Union. Trust between regulators and the regulated was not ample at the time. The experiment that was performed, of course, was silly, but if it had to be performed, it should have been cleared before with the regulators. And of course the design of the plant was very bad, with neither prevention nor mitigation, and yes, let's not dwell too much on that. So there was immediately a public information problem, and John now had to put himself in the position of a member of the public who hasn't heard really about radiation, doesn't know anything except the fact that probably it's very dangerous for you. And what he did was to make sure immediately that the cloud reached Britain, that he would be able to provide accurate information on the possibility of risks, that the information would be clear, and that it would be accessible, so he would make sure that NRPB were capable of using all the technical facilities that were at hand at the time. This, of course, was a major accident with many people getting acute radiation syndrome, a number of people dying immediately from radiation, and probably about 20 people dying from after effects of deterministic radiation harm. And of course a couple of people died directly because of the explosion. And the release from this accident was something like 10 to the 19 becquerels, and the amount of iodine was 1,000 times that had been released at Windscape, which was in itself enough to require these grazing and milk restrictions. And we've had all these thyroid cancer cases. People usually don't die because of thyroid cancer, but it becomes very unpleasant and you need medication for all your life after you've had the surgery that is needed. And then, of course, I can easily point to a merited person who says there will be 40 million future cancer cases due to Chernobyl. I can also pop up with somebody who says there are no cancer cases due to Chernobyl, and I can easily also give you estimates, all of which are scientifically valid, very, very useful from very serious people, which range from 4,000 cancer cases to 400,000 cases, which is a very good illustration of why ICRP feels that this sort of number exercise is meaningless, useless and counterproductive. What you need to say is not there will be 4,582 cancer cases. What you need to say is there will be a number of cancer cases, and let's concentrate not on the number but on making sure that this doesn't happen. And of course there will be other diseases as well. And the New York Academy of Sciences, to the great consternation of the scientific community, has published a report by somebody called Jack Valentin. He is the editor of the book, which claims that several 100,000 people have died in the Soviet Union already due to radiation from Chernobyl. And the problem with that is that basically he's taking all deaths that have occurred in the Soviet Union and included them in his estimate. Just one brief word about Fukushima, a rare but perhaps avoidable accident, and apologies to Richard for having stolen this picture, which I do not have copyright for. The problem, of course, here is that we had a reasonable but somewhat old-fashioned design. There was insufficient protection against the tsunami. Now, after the presentation 2 years ago, I've learned that in fact there was another emergency cooling system that the staff didn't know about and therefore never used, and which probably would have worked if it had ever been used. In any case, the prevention is better in the modern design. With the emergency pumps too low, there was no passive safety cooling and so forth, and in particular the mitigation would have been better in a modern design with filtered containment venting and a core meltdown trap and so forth. And basically these plants were not in quite the right place. I'm not alien to the thought that you might have a nuclear power plant where there are earthquakes and tsunamis, but you need, in that case, to design them for these things and to take account of them. The consequences were, says the agency, of the same sort as the consequences of Chernobyl, which is very strange when you have one case where, well, 20,000 deaths by the latest count were due to the earthquake and tsunami, but not a single person contracted acute radiation syndrome, let alone any serious consequence. So it's very difficult to understand a descriptive system which was devised to talk to members of the public, where you get the same risk estimate from Chernobyl, or risk descriptor from Chernobyl and from Fukushima, when in one case it was a major disaster and in another case it was an accident. Nevertheless, 200,000 people were evacuated, and the evacuations were not the same for all countries. The Japanese did not distribute iodine pills. People from other countries had iodine pills at their embassies. In our particular case, we actually asked people, Swedish citizens living in Japan at the time, to take iodine pills which were distributed to them, not because we particularly feared that they would need them, but because of the practical distribution problem, it was much easier to hand out these pills and say to them, take the bloody pills, it won't harm you, but if the accident gets worse, it will be nice that you've taken the pills. But we've got a lot of stick from Brussels afterwards for having done this. But I think it's simply a case of optimization. The good thing, and where John comes in again, was that the Japanese, although they might not have designed everything perfectly, once the accident had happened, a lot of heroic people did the right things, and the milk restrictions that were needed, the other restrictions on food, were effected very promptly. And it was thanks to John's foresight back in 1957 that we now had the tools at hand immediately to do the things that limited the doses from an accident that could have led to many, many unpleasant effects. Turning now to John's final year, John was a very hospitable person. He was very kind. He would want you to come and visit. And of course, in his final year, he was too old, and Rose was too old to let people come into their house any longer. So we would usually go to restaurants when we had met. But he would be very keen to get home to show me what was on his computer, and usually the technicalities of his latest radiological protection device were far beyond me and my understanding. But he did teach me one thing, and that was how to set up your screen so that the letters were large enough for an old person to read. To summarize now, what is the legacy? What have we learned about a wonderful person, and what was so important with John? That he was competent, that he was razor sharp and incredibly swift. And I know a lot of incredibly swift people. Some of them are razor sharp, some others are competent. It's very rare that you find somebody with all these qualities at the same time. He was utterly honest, which could be rather painful at times, and I've been at the receiving end many times learning that my IQ was not up at his level. He was utterly courageous. He didn't hesitate for one moment to say what was very unpopular in the government, with people, with friends, whoever. He always said the right thing, no matter what the consequences. He was very curious, always very interested in learning about things, and if some other person said something outrageous to him, he would immediately say, why are you saying that? Can you explain that to me? If you're right, that's quite interesting. He was unpretentious. He was not the sort of lofty person who wouldn't speak to you because you were just a very junior member of a committee. And he was, as you understand, a very generous person. And it just remains for me to thank a lot of people who provided input for this presentation, and of course Rose and John themselves for telling me so much. Thank you very much for listening to me.